Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible Unlocked Live. This is week 9 of our series on real people, real lessons as we learn from the road well traveled. My name is Sam. I'm going to be your host for this evening, and tonight we have a very special guest. It's Joel Suntz, who is going to be leading us in a discussion on King Hezekiah. As always, we just want to give you a bit of a rundown for the evening of our schedule this evening. So we're going to start, as we said, by looking at Hezekiah. Hezekiah was one of the kings of Judah, and specifically we're going to look at the faith that he had. Then we're going to look at real places of the Bible, and tonight we're going to be looking at Assyria, which was one of the enemies of Judah, as we'll see in a moment. And then we want to dig a little bit deeper into the topic of faith and explore what faith looks like and how it can be developed. But first, I'm going to turn the mic over to Joel for his talk on Hezekiah. And maybe, Joel, if you don't mind, you can just tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you do.
Sure. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate you having me on today. A little bit about myself. I am a father of 3. I live in Ontario, Cayuga, Ontario, to be specific. We are such a small town, we don't have a population sign, which is kind of the way that I like it. And we're going to look tonight at one of my favorite characters in the Bible, Hezekiah. So I run our Sunday school at Brant County, and I love looking at lessons like this that can kind of challenge us to grow as people in faith in particular, and how we put that faith into action. So Hezekiah was a king of Judah. He's one of the best, most righteous kings that they had. In fact, he's known in the Bible as one of the 3 great reformers who was able to have an incredible positive impact on the nation of Judah, God's people. And Hezekiah lived and reigned about 300 years after David, give or take, and a little over 600 years before Jesus, just to put things in perspective of where we are in our timeline here. Now, if you had to describe Hezekiah with a single word, it would be the word trust. We actually take that right from a passage in the Bible from 2nd of Kings chapter 18 and verse 5. And this characteristic is going to be central to our consideration today. Trusting in God is an essential component to serving him, and it enabled Hezekiah to harness an incredible skill that would benefit all of us. It's the skill of perspective. Hezekiah learned not to trust his eyes and not to trust his own experience, but instead to rely on God. Now, I want to take you back thousands of years ago to one specific event in the 15th year of the reign of King Hezekiah. The Assyrians that Sam mentioned at the open of our session here were the enemies of the nation of Judah. And historically, they were noted for being an incredibly cruel and oppressive nation. Everybody was afraid of the Assyrians. Hezekiah decided to rebel against the Assyrians. And so the Assyrians marched an army of 185,000 soldiers against Jerusalem, which is the capital city of the kingdom of Judah. Now, I want you to imagine what it must have been like to be alive at the time of this king, of King Hezekiah, and to look out over these walls of the city and to see this army of the Assyrians, an army that's 185,000 people strong, that seemed so large that it stretched out past the horizon. Now, imagine knowing just how ruthless this nation was, and they'd come to destroy you and your family and your city. Imagine what it must have felt like to live in this total fear through a siege where food and freedoms of daily life were running out, if not already gone. As a king and a leader in this situation, knowing that you're outnumbered and basically out of options, what do you say? What do you do? And how do you inspire and comfort your people? Well, we know exactly what Hezekiah said and the effect that it had. In 2 Chronicles 32 and verse 6, we read that he, Hezekiah, gathered the people together to him in the street of the gate of the city and spake comfortably to them, saying, Be strong and courageous, be not afraid nor dismayed for the king of Assyria, nor for all the multitude that is with him, for there be more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. and the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Imagine being such a great public speaker that in a few short sentences, you can calm all the fears of the people. I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. Now, it might not be obvious, but what Hezekiah is really doing is he's asking the people to stop relying on what they see and what they are personally experiencing. Instead, Hezekiah is actually reminding the nation about some pretty incredible times in history when God had delivered his people, their ancestors, out of some pretty terrible situations. Now, Hezekiah is actually reflecting on four different events that would challenge the nation to stop trusting in their eyes and to start trusting in God. And I think we're only given just a little taste of what Hezekiah actually said. So let's build together what we think the speech actually was. When Hezekiah says to be strong and courageous, he's actually quoting words that were spoken to Joshua in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 6. In fact, these words were spoken to Joshua numerous times. You see, Joshua was the leader of the nation of Israel who succeeded Moses. And it was Joshua's job to be the one who would lead Israel from wandering in the wilderness into the land of Canaan, the land that we now call Israel. And what did this involve? Well, it involved conquering people who were giants. It involved conquering fortified cities like Jericho, that's pictured here, and even crossing the mighty Jordan River with a large group of people. Joshua and the people that were with him were afraid, but time and time again, God would remind and encourage Joshua, be strong and courageous. And in the end, Joshua and the people successfully conquered the land and now would occupy it as the land that God had promised to Abraham, their ancestor. Now, when Hezekiah says, be not afraid nor dismayed, I believe that he's quoting from an event in the life of another great king, King Jehoshaphat. Now, this is from events recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 15. And during this time in King Jehoshaphat's reign, the Ammonites and the Moabites, who are other enemies of the nation of Israel, they've come against the kingdom of Judah to conquer them. But God specifically tells the people, don't worry, you're not even going to have to conquer them. You're not even going to have to fight in the battle. So Jehoshaphat builds an army, but it's the strangest army you've probably ever heard of, because after he builds the army, the people he puts at the front of the army to lead it are a choir. The following day, this army, led by the choir, marches into battle, singing hymns to God. And by the time they reach the Moabite Ammonite army, everybody in the Moabite Ammonite army is dead. Now, when Hezekiah says there be more with us than with them, he's quoting from the life of Elisha the prophet. Now, this God-fearing prophet was in a house with his servant in a city called Dothan. And the Syrian army, again, more enemies of the nation of Israel, had come and surrounded this city, and they were looking to conquer it. Now, imagine what it would have felt like to be Elisha's servant. One morning, he opens the door from the house that they were staying in, and he sees that they are completely surrounded by this Assyrian army, and he's afraid for his life. So he runs to get his master, and when he tells him what's happened, Elisha isn't bothered. He's not worried at all. And when the servant tries to understand why his master isn't afraid of this Syrian army, Elisha responds, there are more with us than with them. And after uttering those words, Elisha prays that God would open the eyes of the servant. And what the servant then sees is an army of angels and chariots of fire encircling them. God then blinds the army, and Elisha leads them captive. Now, the phrase, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles, comes from the life of another great king. In fact, the first great reformer king of Judah, his name was Asa. And this event is recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 14. And that quote specifically comes from verse 11. We're told that an army of 1,000,000, for those of you that are struggling to do math today like me, that's 1 million. This is the largest army that is ever recorded in the Bible. And they've come to battle against Judah. And here's Judah, terribly outnumbered. And so Asa prays to God. He's looking for assistance. And we're told in scripture that God defeated and destroyed the army of the Ethiopians, not Asa. So Hezekiah wasn't necessarily a great public speaker. Instead, Hezekiah was probably more like a great historian. Here he was looking out over this army of 185,000 brutal, cruel, angry Assyrians. And Hezekiah says, I'm not afraid. Look at how many times we or our ancestors have been in this situation before, and God was able to save them then, and he's able to save us now. The most incredible part in so many of these situations is that the people who were alive during these battles often didn't even need to pick up a sword. And do you know what happened in the case of Hezekiah? Well, Second of Chronicles chapter 32 and verse 21 tells us that God sent an angel and he destroyed the entire army. Nobody even left the safety of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. What this incredible speech from this faithful king teaches me is that we need to challenge our own perspective, especially when challenging times arise in our lives. Instead of trusting in what we see with our own eyes, we need to learn to trust in God. We've been reminded that our God has won battles, our God has protected his people, our God has power over nature, and our God can deliver us and grant us a place in his kingdom if we trust in him.
Well, thank you so much, Joel. I really appreciate you coming on tonight to share what you've learned from Hezekiah and others who show just incredible faith. And just so everyone knows, Joel is going to be sticking on for a little bit afterward, so we can talk just a bit more about the faith that these Bible characters had. But first, we're going to move on to our segment of the week on real places of the Bible. These are places that play a very specific role in the lives of the people that we're looking at. And so tonight, we're going to take a look at the land of Assyria.
The faith of King Hezekiah is never more evident than when his kingdom is put under siege by the mighty King Sennacherib of Assyria, and he has to put his complete and total faith in God to save him from this vicious campaign. Now, the reason this was such a great act of faith is that in the days of ancient Israel, the Assyrians were known as a terrible, conquering nation. God actually says that he uses them as a weapon of judgment against nations in Isaiah 10. Not only were they a mighty conquering force, but they were cruel and heartless when they conquered. There's actually this vision in Daniel 7, where Daniel sees a bunch of beasts come out of the sea, and one of these beasts is a lion that has wings, and at one point it stands up and it's actually given the heart of a man. Now, what does this peculiar vision mean? Well, the lion at first is Assyria, and when it stands up and changes, it becomes Babylon. Because the Babylonians actually took over from the Assyrians when the Assyrian Empire fell. And we'll talk about Babylon in a future segment. But notice what it said there when it turned into Babylon. It says that the lion was given a heart. This means that while the lion was Assyria, it didn't have any heart at all. It was a heartless lion. And this is what the Assyrian captivity was like. They were heartless, and they were ruthless, and they were cruel. I'm not going to get into the gory details, but there are many reliefs in museums, especially in the British Museum, where we see the depictions of cruelty that the Assyrians took pride in and immortalized in their reliefs. The other thing that Assyria was known for was their pride. When they came against King Hezekiah, they boasted about their conquest with many speeches. In fact, in one of our previous segments where we looked at the Taylor Prism, King Sennacherib just makes a prism that's all about bragging about himself and his might. Isaiah 10 actually quotes Assyria saying, "By the strength of my hand I have done it," when we know that God was the one who was controlling them in their conquests and giving them these victories. This mighty, heartless Assyrian pride tried to overcome God himself in taking the city from Hezekiah, but finally met its match when God took away all their power in just one night. We need to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to become proud of our accomplishments, when it's God that gives us the strength and ability to live every single day. Because if we do forget, God is able to take it all away in an instant, and then we would just be like the king of Assyria.
As always, big thank you to the team that puts those together. And of course, if you like watching those videos and you want to see more just like it, we have those up on our YouTube channel. You just need to search Bible Unlocked on YouTube. So what we want to do now is talk a little bit more about faith, because we've seen how Hezekiah was a very faithful man. He trusted in God at times when it would be very difficult. And there's lots of Bible examples, as we saw tonight, where people had faith when it wasn't easy to do so. And so what we want to do now is talk a little bit more about faith and see how we can develop that faith for ourselves. So I've got a couple questions for you, Joel, and also for those of you who are listening in tonight, these are some questions that you're welcome to answer as well. So feel free to pull up the chat window and you can type in any answers that you'd like to. So my first question for you, Joel, is whether or not there are some other Bible characters that believed beyond what they could see.
This is such a great question, Sam, because as you pointed out, scripture is full of these examples. And probably the best one that I can think of that we haven't touched on already is Moses. We talked a little bit about Joshua, who succeeded Moses, and he was the one that brought the children of Israel into the promised land, into the land of Canaan, now known as Israel. But what was Moses's job? Well, Moses was appointed by God to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt because they were slaves in Egypt. He was freeing his people from that bondage, and then he was going to bring them toward the promised land. And we know the 10 plagues were poured out on Egypt because they wouldn't let the children of Israel go. They kept asking and asking and asking. And finally, after 10 plagues are poured out, they said, go. But no sooner had Israel left Egypt and they realized their mistake. And they said, well, all our slaves are gone. So they sent the army, the Egyptian army, after them with horses and chariots. And so you've got this nation of young and old and everyone in between who's traveling on foot. They don't own horses. They don't own cars. And they're running away from Egypt. And they can see this army coming after them. And they hit the Red Sea, this enormous sea. They can't go north. They can't go south. They can't cross it. And so they start to complain to Moses, and they're afraid. What are we going to do? They say. You see, in their lifetime, there was nothing that anyone had ever experienced to indicate that waters of a sea could part, but that's exactly what's going to happen. And so Moses takes his staff in his hand and he encourages the people and he says, stand still and see the salvation of God. And he raises his staff, and with that, the waters of the Red Sea part and there's dry land, and the whole nation can cross over this dry land. And no sooner do they get across and the Egyptian chariots come into that dry area, that the waters come crashing down and destroy that army. So there was no experience that anyone had had to this point that would lead them to believe that God could part the seas. But Moses, and because of Moses, the entire nation had faith in something they'd never seen or experienced before. And that really is the power of God. And that's the faith that Hezekiah was trying to evoke in the people when he delivered this comfortable speech to them.
Yeah, it's such a great example, and I see Ashley had Moses as well. And there's lots of other good ones that people are bringing up. Kath mentions Abraham, and I mean, he believed in a lot of things he couldn't see. One of them would be the promised son that God promised to him when technically speaking, they were way too old for that to happen. There's the example of Noah, who was building an ark. God said that this flood would be coming, and so he started building years in advance, and a lot of people, they looked down on him because of it. They thought he was crazy for what he was doing, but he really believed in what God had said. There's other good examples there. Joseph, the blind man in John chapter 9 and 10, and also Rahab, which we will be looking at next week, so that should be interesting. So thank you everyone for those examples, lots of good ones there. Now, looking at these examples of people who believed in things they couldn't see, it brings up something that I know I've struggled with before, and I know critics of the Bible and of Christianity in general would probably bring this up, and that's the question of whether or not faith is blind, because we can easily be criticized for believing in a God that we've never seen, or believing in these promises from a God we've never seen. So I just wonder, Joel, if you have any thoughts as to whether or not faith is blind.
I think this is such a great question because I would be inclined to revisit the story of Elisha that we've already looked at. And I think it's so interesting to see the contrast between Elisha and his servant. And it's a good reminder that just because we aren't seeing certain things doesn't mean they aren't there. The servant couldn't see the angels and the chariots of fire, but I think it's obvious from the record that Elisha could. And so Elisha prays that the servant's eyes be opened, and lo and behold, there they are. So that faith that Elisha had is so important for us to develop. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to see God this side of the kingdom, but there are things that God has given us that we can point to. We can look at creation all around us. I mean, how incredible is this world that God has created? And there's archaeology. I mean, one of the examples came up in the video that Jake put on for us, and we have the Taylor Prism. We know there's the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries, which are the oldest manuscripts we have of the Bible we hold today. We have inscriptions like the one that was found at Tel Dan that references the house of David. So we know that he was a real person. And I love that this is so relevant to our subject tonight. But archaeologists have actually uncovered Hezekiah's tunnel. So during the siege of the Assyrians, Hezekiah was trying to do what he could to support his people. And he built this incredible tunnel to bring water into the city. And what he did was he started on both sides of the tunnel and they met in the middle almost perfectly. And that allowed water to come from outside the city walls into the center of the city so that the people had water to drink while they were under siege. Now, that tunnel, we can go and visit it today. You can actually walk through Hezekiah's tunnel if you go to Jerusalem. I think that's amazing. So we have all of these things in archaeology that we've discovered that give us proof about the Bible. But people like Hezekiah, they didn't need to see the miracles that God had performed beforehand to know that God could and would do it again. And I think the lesson that we've been trying to tease out of Hezekiah's life today is that we need to stop trusting in the way that we see the world, but instead come to see the world as God sees it. And if we could do that, well, let's loop in this verse here on the screen from Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. It tells us that without faith, it's impossible to please him. In fact, we're reminded that whoever would draw near to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I think Hezekiah lived by these words, and how remarkable his faith was, and how pleasing that must have been to God.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. And I think Kathy brings up a good point as well. She says, I can always see faith in action. So not only is faith not blind in the sense that we believe in God for all the things that he's done and the evidence like the archaeology that we've seen or you've talked about, but also our faith should be visible to other people through the actions that we take as we try to serve God. So thank you, Kathy. I think that's a great point to bring up. I've got one more question for you, Joel, that I think builds off of the last one. And again, if anyone here listening wants to chime in, that would be wonderful. But I would love if you could just share a couple, maybe one or two ideas about how we can develop faith in our own lives.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share. And I think it's great the answer that Kathy's already given, because I mean, that's really the direction we're heading. If we look at this verse on the screen from Romans chapter 10 and verse 17, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So the first step is immersing ourselves in God's word. We need to know who he is, what he's promised, and that will help us develop our faith. But then we have passages like the Epistle of James that help us understand that faith really is belief plus action. It's not enough to just believe, but we need to do something with that belief, like Kathy pointed out. So, what can we do? Well, there's a parable that Christ tells. It's called the parable of the sheep and the goats. It's found in Matthew 25. And the sheep represent people who are called faithful. We're told that they're the ones that are going to receive a reward from God. And we're told why. It's because they were hospitable to others. They cared for them, they fed them, they provided clothing, they visited them when they were sick. And they did all of these things simply because they cared. Actually doing is they were showing the character of God. So this kind of brings us full circle then. What I'm really saying is that we need to read the Bible to understand God's character. And then we need to start acting more like God. And that cycle is what's going to help develop our faith.
Well, thanks again, Joel, and thank you everyone here tonight for your participation. I think it's really awesome that we can have these conversations about the Bible. So we're going to wrap up here. I just want to remind you about a couple things. First of all, our session for next week, we're going to be looking at the life of Rahab. It's what you are, not who you were. And just a reminder that next week will be our last session before the holiday break. So we'll be on next week, and then we won't be online again until January 9th. As always, Joel and I are going to stick around for a couple minutes once we close in case anyone has any questions or comments. And I'm seeing a couple come through here privately, so that's awesome. So we'll answer those. But first, we're just going to close with a word of prayer to thank God for giving us this time tonight.